Wade Merritt had spent 10 years running from his past, finding peace only in the desert's silence. At 58, with a bad knee and a heart heavy with regrets, he thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But on a dusty Nevada morning, a tiny bobcat kitten began following him through the sagebrush. Mile after mile, the little creature trailed behind, refusing to leave. When Wade finally stopped to offer water, what he discovered would change everything. The kitten bore surgical scars and an embedded tag, evidence of illegal experiments hidden deep in the valley. Someone had been testing on innocent animals, and this little survivor was living proof. What happens when a man who's avoided trouble for years suddenly becomes the only one who can stop it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet crested the Toyabe Mountains when Wade Merritt pulled on his worn boots and stepped onto the weathered porch of his ranch house. The high desert air carried the sharp bite of early spring, clean and thin, at 4,000 feet above sea level. He'd been rising before dawn for 10 years now, ever since the silence became his only companion. His border collie, Scout, emerged from the shadows and fell into step beside him, the dog's black and white coat still thick with winter fur. At 12 years old, Scout moved with the careful dignity of age, understanding without words that their morning routine was sacred territory, a ritual that kept both man and dog anchored to something larger than grief. Wade's ranch sprawled across 80 acres of Nevada, high desert, where sagebrush stretched toward purple mountains, and the sky seemed wide enough to hold every regret he'd ever carried. The main house, built in the 1940s by a mining family, sat sturdy and unadorned against the landscape. Its cedar siding had weathered to silver gray, and the metal roof bore the patina of decades under an unforgiving sun. Behind the house, a red barn housed his few animals and the remnants of a life he'd tried to leave behind. His gelding, Copper, nickered from the pasture fence as Wade approached. The horse was 17 years old, a quarter horse with the deep chest and strong legs of his breeding, but also the patience that came from years of partnership with a man who preferred solitude. Wade ran his hand along the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of muscle and bone beneath the thick coat. "Morning, old friend," Wade murmured, his voice rough from disuse. In the early years after Sarah's death, he'd gone days without speaking to another human being. The animals had been his salvation then, creatures who demanded nothing more than care and offered in return the kind of companionship that didn't require explanations or apologies. Wade checked the water, troughs and hay feeders with the methodical attention of a man who understood that routine was medicine. Each task performed correctly meant another day successfully navigated, another sunrise witnessed, another small victory against the weight of memory that had nearly crushed him a decade ago. Under his flannel shirt, his dog tags rested against his chest, two pieces of metal that most days he forgot he wore. Staff Sergeant Wade Merritt, United States Army Veterinary Corps, served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2003 to 2008. The tags held the basic facts of his service, but they couldn't contain the weight of what he'd seen or the skills he'd learned in treating animals wounded by war. He'd been good at his job, maybe too good. While other soldiers learned to kill, Wade had learned to heal. He'd patched up military working dogs torn by improvised explosive devices, treated horses belonging to Afghan farmers caught in crossfire, and even cared for stray cats that had somehow survived in forward operating bases. His reputation had spread through the ranks. Wade Merritt could save animals that other veterinarians would have given up on. But healing had its costs. Every animal he'd saved carried with it the memory of 2 or 3 he couldn't. Every successful surgery was shadowed by the faces of handlers who'd lost their partners, farmers who'd lost their livelihood, children who'd lost their pets to the casual violence of war. When he'd finally come home in 2008, Wade had carried those shadows with him. Sarah had understood, perhaps better than he'd realized at the time. She'd been a research scientist with a PhD in biochemistry, working for various pharmaceutical companies in the development of new treatments. Her work had taken her away from home frequently, but she'd always returned with stories that matched his own. The weight of responsibility for lives that couldn't speak for themselves, the burden of knowledge that came with the power to heal or fail to heal. They'd found peace together in this desert valley, 40 miles from the nearest town. Sarah had continued her research from a small laboratory she'd built in the barn's loft, while Wade had established a modest practice treating ranch animals for the scattered ranchers and farmers in the area. For 7 years, they'd built something good together, a life measured not in achievements or accumulations, but in the quiet satisfaction of useful work and honest love. Cancer had taken her on a Tuesday morning in October 2014. Wade still remembered the weight of her hand in his as she'd slipped away, still remembered the last words she'd whispered, "Take care of them for me." He'd assumed she meant the animals, but in the years since, he'd sometimes wondered if she'd meant something larger, the community they'd served together, the broken things in the world that needed tending. After the funeral, he'd closed his practice and retreated into solitude. His daughter Rebecca had tried to convince him to move to Denver, where she worked as a pediatric nurse and could keep an eye on him. But Wade had needed the desert's honesty, its refusal to offer false comfort. Here, survival required daily attention to practical things. Here, the mountains and sky were large enough to contain his grief without being diminished by it. Rebecca called once a month, their conversations careful and polite, both of them avoiding the larger questions that lay between them. She was 32 now, unmarried, devoted to her work with sick children. Wade suspected she'd inherited her mother's gift for healing, but he also worried that she'd inherited his tendency to carry the weight of every failure. Their last conversation had ended with her asking again if he was taking care of himself. He'd assured her he was, and technically it was true. He was maintaining his body, his property, his animals. But they both knew there was a difference between surviving and living. His nearest neighbor, Dolores Martinez, understood that difference. At 62, she was 10 years younger than Sarah would have been, a retired high school teacher who'd moved to the valley after her husband's death 3 years ago. Her small house sat 2 miles south of Wade's ranch, close enough for assistance in emergencies, far enough away to respect the boundary of solitude he'd established. Dolores had a gift for appearing at the right moments, bringing a casserole when she happened to make too much, or asking for help with a project when she probably could have managed alone. She never mentioned his isolation directly, never pushed for more conversation than he was willing to offer. But her presence reminded him that human connection was still possible, even for someone who'd forgotten how to reach for it. As Wade saddled Copper for their morning ride, he found himself thinking about the choices that had led him to this life. The army had taught him discipline and purpose. Sarah had taught him love and partnership. The desert had taught him endurance and acceptance. But somewhere in the process of learning these lessons, he'd also learned to be afraid of losing what he cared about, afraid of the responsibility that came with caring, afraid of the pain that seemed inevitably to follow attachment. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd spent years healing animals had become afraid of the very connections that made healing possible. A veterinarian who'd once been known for taking on the hardest cases had retreated from anything that required emotional risk. He'd become expert at managing physical needs while carefully avoiding anything that might touch the deeper wound that Sarah's death had left behind. Scout had taken to riding along on these morning excursions, trotting alongside Copper with the purposeful gait of a dog who understood his place in the small pack they'd formed. The three of them would cover 6 or 7 miles through the network of cattle trails that crisscrossed the valley, Wade checking fence lines and water sources for neighbors who'd hired him for basic ranch maintenance. It was simple work that paid enough to cover his modest expenses and kept him connected, however loosely, to the community of ranchers and farmers who still worked this hard country. The work also served another purpose. It gave structure to days that might otherwise dissolve into the kind of purposeless drift that he'd learned was dangerous for a man living alone. Depression, he'd discovered, was a subtle enemy. It didn't announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious symptoms. Instead, it crept in through small compromises, sleeping a little later each morning, skipping a meal here and there, putting off repairs that could wait another day. Before you knew it, the structure that held your life together had eroded, and you were left with nothing but empty hours and the weight of your own thoughts. So Wade maintained his routines with the discipline of a man who understood their importance. Up before dawn, animals fed and watered, morning ride completed, afternoon devoted to whatever maintenance work the day required. Evenings spent reading by the fire, Scout curled on the hearth rug, the silence of the desert settling around them like a familiar blanket. It was a life that worked in its way. Limited, perhaps, but sustainable. Safe, certainly, but also sterile. Wade had achieved a kind of equilibrium that protected him from further loss by ensuring he had nothing left to lose. He told himself it was enough, this careful existence at the margins of community and connection. Most days he almost believed it, but as he swung into the saddle and pointed copper toward the morning trail, Wade carried with him the nagging sense that something was shifting in the careful balance he'd maintained for 10 years. The feeling was vague, more intuition than knowledge, but it had been growing stronger over the past few weeks. Maybe it was the approach of spring, with its insistent reminders that the world continued to change and grow even when you tried to hold it still. Maybe it was the way Dolores had looked at him during their last brief conversation, as if she could see something in him that he couldn't see in himself. Or maybe it was simply time, the slow accumulation of days lived in deliberate isolation, finally reaching some critical mass that demanded change. Wade didn't know. What he did know was that the desert morning felt different somehow, charged with possibility in a way that both excited and frightened him. As Copper settled into his steady walking pace and Scout fell into step beside them, Wade allowed himself to wonder what that change might bring, and whether he would be ready for it when it came. The Bobcat kitten weighed maybe 3 pounds, its tawny fur marked with the distinctive spots and ear tufts of its species. Wade carried it into the barn carefully, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against his palm. In the 10 years since he'd stopped practicing veterinary medicine, he'd forgotten how small wild creatures could seem when removed from their natural element. He'd set up a makeshift examination area on the workbench years ago, back when he'd still occasionally treated animals for neighbors. The equipment was basic but functional, a battery-powered lamp, some old surgical instruments he'd never quite been able to throw away, and a magnifying glass with LED lights that Sarah had given him for Christmas one year. Most of it hadn't been used in years, but Wade maintained it with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything else in his life. The kitten lay quietly as he examined it, which should have been his first clue that something was wrong. Wild bobcats, even young ones, didn't submit passively to handling by humans. This one watched him with amber eyes that held an unsettling mixture of intelligence and resignation, as if it had learned to accept procedures it couldn't escape. Wade began with the basics, checking body temperature, heart rate, respiratory pattern. Everything fell within normal ranges, but as he ran his hands over the small body, he felt anomalies that made his stomach tighten. There were tiny scars hidden beneath the fur, thin lines that spoke of careful surgical incisions. Most were healed, some still pink with recent healing. Behind the left ear, he found what he'd hoped he wouldn't find, a small area where the fur grew differently, as if it had been shaved and was still growing back. When he parted the hair, he could see a tiny incision mark, barely visible but unmistakably surgical in origin. Something had been implanted there, something small and foreign that didn't belong in a wild animal's body. Wade's hands moved with the remembered precision of his army training as he palpated the area. There, a small, hard object just beneath the skin, electronic from the feel of it, sophisticated, the kind of thing that cost serious money and required serious expertise to implant. "What did they do to you, little one?" Wade murmured, his voice rougher than he'd intended. He'd seen enough military working dogs fitted with tracking devices to recognize the signs. But those had been voluntary partnerships between soldiers and animals trained for specific missions. This was something else entirely, something that made his chest tight with old anger he'd thought he'd learned to control. The kitten made a soft chirping sound, somewhere between a meow and the chattering call adult bobcats used to communicate. But the sound was wrong, too controlled, as if it had been modified or conditioned. Wade had heard military working dogs make similar sounds after intensive training, vocalizations that served specific purposes. Rather than expressing natural emotion, he spent the next hour documenting what he found. More scars, some from injection sites, others from what appeared to be minor surgical procedures. The kitten's reactions were too measured, too compliant. Someone had trained it to accept human handling, but not with the patience and positive reinforcement that characterized legitimate animal training. This had the hallmarks of conditioning through repetition and constraint. Wade's veterinary training had included courses in animal psychology and behavior modification. He'd learned to recognize the signs of trauma in animals that had been subjected to experimental procedures or inadequate care. This kitten displayed several red flags: hypervigilance combined with learned helplessness, physical compliance that masked emotional withdrawal, and stress responses that suggested prolonged exposure to laboratory conditions. When he was finished with the examination, Wade sat back on his stool and studied the small creature resting on the towel he'd provided. The kitten looked back at him with those two wise eyes, and for a moment Wade felt the weight of recognition pass between them. They were both survivors of experiences that had changed them, both carrying scars that weren't entirely visible from the outside. "I'm going to call you Echo," Wade said quietly. The name felt right somehow. This little creature was a reflection of something larger, a sound bouncing back from places he couldn't yet see. The decision to keep her surprised him. For 10 years, he'd avoided taking responsibility for anything that might require emotional investment. But sitting in the barn with this damaged kitten, Wade felt something awakening in him that he'd thought was permanently buried, the protective instinct that had once driven him to save every wounded animal that crossed his path. He made Echo a temporary bed in an old dog crate lined with blankets, setting it near enough to the wood stove to keep her warm, but far enough away to avoid overheating. She settled into the space with the careful efficiency of an animal that had learned to make the best of confined spaces. Another behavioral marker that reinforced Wade's growing certainty about her origins. The questions multiplied as the day wore on. Who was conducting animal experiments in this remote valley? How many other animals were involved? And why release them into the wild afterward, instead of disposing of them through proper channels? The last question bothered him most because it suggested either incompetence or something more sinister. Perhaps the intentional establishment of a wild population of modified animals for longer-term study. That evening, Wade made a phone call he'd been avoiding for 5 years. Dr. Marcus Reed had been his closest friend during their army service, a fellow veterinarian who'd specialized in military working dog programs. Marcus had continued his military career after Wade's discharge, eventually retiring as a full colonel and taking a position with the Department of Defense's Animal Research Oversight Division. "Wade Merritt," Marcus said when he answered, his voice carrying the warm recognition of old friendship. "I was beginning to think you'd dropped off the face of the earth." "Close enough," Wade replied. "Marcus, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to keep it between us for now." The conversation that followed was careful and professional, Wade describing his findings without identifying the specific location or his own involvement. Marcus listened without interruption, asking technical questions that confirmed Wade's suspicions about the sophistication of what he'd discovered. "What you're describing sounds like a commercial research operation," Marcus said finally. Military contracts, probably, but conducted by private companies under less stringent oversight than we'd maintain in official facilities. The implant you found, can you describe it in more detail? Wade provided what information he could, Marcus asking follow-up questions that revealed his deep knowledge of current animal research technologies. When they finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Wade, if what you're telling me is accurate, this represents a significant breach of research protocols. Animals aren't supposed to be released after experimental procedures, especially not with active implants. Someone is either grossly negligent or deliberately trying to hide evidence. What would you recommend? Officially, report it to local authorities and let them handle the investigation. Unofficially, be very careful. Companies that conduct this kind of research have significant resources and strong motivations to protect their operations. If they're cutting corners on containment and disposal, they're probably cutting corners on other safety measures too. After the call ended, Wade sat in his kitchen with Echo curled in his lap, her small body warm against his chest. Outside, the desert night was settling into its familiar rhythm of wind and silence. But Wade felt as if something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. For 10 years, he'd maintained his distance from anything that might require him to take a stand, to risk conflict, to potentially lose something he cared about. He'd built a life around avoiding the kinds of moral imperatives that had once driven him to stay awake nights, worrying about wounded animals under his care. But Echo changed the calculation. She was evidence of suffering he couldn't ignore, a survivor of cruelty he couldn't pretend didn't exist. Worse, she was proof that the suffering was ongoing, systematic, and happening in his own backyard. The isolation that had protected him for a decade now felt like a barrier preventing him from doing what his conscience demanded. Wade looked down at the kitten, sleeping trustfully, in his lap, and felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. He'd spent years learning to live with the silence, but Echo had brought with her the echo of something he'd tried to forget, the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting meant risking everything you'd worked to protect. The electronic tag embedded behind her ear represented more than evidence of corporate malfeasance. It was a challenge, a question posed by her simple presence in his life. What kind of man had he become, and what kind of man did he want to be? Wade stroked Echo's fur gently and felt the first stirrings of purpose he'd experienced in years. Tomorrow, he would begin asking questions that might lead to dangerous answers. Tonight, he would simply offer comfort to a creature that had known too little of it, and begin the process of remembering what it felt like to care about something beyond his own. Carefully protected solitude, Wade's veterinary medical kit had been packed away in the barn's storage room for 8 years, wrapped in oiled canvas and stored with the kind of care reserved for things too valuable to discard but too painful to use. When he unwrapped it the morning after finding Echo, the familiar weight of the instruments brought back memories he'd thought were safely buried. The kit itself was military issue, designed for field conditions and built to last. Scalpels, forceps, suture materials, syringes, and a small but comprehensive selection of medications. Everything a veterinarian might need to treat wounded animals in places where proper facilities didn't exist. Wade had carried this kit through 3 tours of duty, and it bore the scars of that service, scratches on the metal case, stains on the canvas pouches, the patina that came from hard use in difficult conditions. He set up a proper examination area in the barn's tack room, clearing space on the old wooden table he'd once used for saddle repairs. The battery-powered surgical light still worked, casting bright, shadowless illumination over the workspace. As he arranged his instruments with the automatic precision of long practice, Wade felt muscle memory taking over, his hands moving through familiar patterns, while his mind struggled to catch up with the implications of what he was doing. Echo submitted to his ministrations with a patience that continued to trouble him. Wild animals, especially predators like bobcats, didn't typically allow extended handling without sedation. But Echo seemed to understand that he meant no harm. Or perhaps she'd simply been conditioned to accept medical procedures regardless of her preferences. The more detailed examination revealed disturbing patterns in the scarring. Multiple injection sites suggested a systematic program of drug administration over an extended period. The surgical incisions were precise, indicating sophisticated equipment and trained personnel. Most troubling were the neurological tests Wade performed. Echo's responses to stimuli were subtly altered, suggesting possible modification of her nervous system. "Someone's been very busy with you, haven't they?" Wade murmured as he documented his findings in a notebook he'd found in the kit's side pocket. The pages were yellowed with age, but his handwriting was as precise as it had been during his army service. The work absorbed him in a way he'd forgotten was possible. For years, his days had been measured in maintenance tasks and routine chores, necessary work that kept his property functioning, but didn't require the kind of focused attention that had once defined his professional life. Caring for Echo demanded everything he'd learned about veterinary medicine and animal behavior, skills that had grown rusty from disuse, but hadn't disappeared entirely. Over the next several days, Wade established a routine around Echo's care. Morning examinations to check her progress, afternoon sessions working on trust-building exercises, evening time simply sitting with her while she grew accustomed to human presence that didn't involve medical procedures. It was slow work, requiring patience and consistency, but Wade found himself looking forward to these sessions with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. Dolores noticed the change during one of her occasional visits. She'd brought a pot roast and cornbread, as she sometimes did when she happened to cook too much, but this time she lingered longer than usual, her sharp eyes taking in the subtle transformations in Wade's demeanor. "You look different," she said, sitting at his kitchen table while he made coffee. "More focused, I suppose. Less like you're just marking time." Wade glanced toward the barn, where Echo was resting in her crate. "I'm helping an injured animal. Nothing more complicated than that." Dolores stirred sugar into her coffee with the deliberate movements of someone who'd taught high school students for 30 years and learned to read between the lines. "What kind of animal?" "Bobcat kitten. Found her following me during my morning ride." "That's unusual behavior for a bobcat." "Yes, it is." Dolores waited, a technique that had served her well in countless parent-teacher conferences. When Wade didn't elaborate, she tried a different approach. "I've been wondering about all the activity down in Copper Canyon lately. Lots of truck traffic, security lights that weren't there before. Do you know anything about that?" Wade's attention sharpened. Copper Canyon was 15 miles south of his property, isolated enough that increased activity would be noticeable to someone familiar with the area's normal patterns. "What kind of trucks?" "The kind that cost more than my house. Clean, expensive vehicles, not the sort of thing you'd expect to see on backcountry roads. And the drivers, well, they don't wave when you pass them, if you know what I mean." After Dolores left, Wade spent the evening researching recent land transactions in the valley. Public records showed several large purchases over the past 3 years, all by companies with names that revealed nothing about their actual business. Desert Vista Holdings, Mountain Research Associates, High Country Development. But when he traced the ownership through corporate filings, a pattern emerged. All 3 companies were subsidiaries of a larger corporation called Apex Biosolutions. The Apex website was professionally designed but deliberately vague about the company's activities. Advancing the frontiers of biological research and committed to innovative solutions for complex challenges were the kinds of phrases that could mean anything or nothing. The leadership page showed executives with impressive credentials in biochemistry, pharmacology, and biomedical engineering, but no specific information about current projects or research focuses. Wade's attempts to contact local authorities the next day proved frustratingly ineffective. The county sheriff's office referred him to the state wildlife department, which referred him to the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, which explained that they couldn't investigate without specific evidence of violations, and suggested he contact the county sheriff's office. The circle of bureaucratic indifference was complete and seemingly impenetrable. Meanwhile, his bond with Echo deepened through the simple repetition of care. She began responding to his voice, following him with her eyes when he moved around the barn, even purring softly when he stroked her fur. But these positive developments were shadowed by his growing understanding of what she'd endured. The behavioral modifications were subtle but pervasive, conditioned, responses that spoke of systematic psychological manipulation designed to make her more compliant and manageable. The memories came back in fragments as Wade worked with Echo. Night missions in Afghanistan where he'd treated working dogs injured by roadside bombs. Forward operating bases where stray animals had somehow found their way inside the perimeter and been adopted by soldiers hungry for connection with something innocent and alive. The weight of responsibility he'd felt for creatures that couldn't advocate for themselves, that depended entirely on human compassion for their survival and well-being. He'd been good at that work, possibly too good for his own emotional health. Sarah had understood the cost of caring so deeply for vulnerable creatures. She'd seen how each loss had carved away a piece of his heart, how the accumulation of failures and tragedies had slowly eroded his resilience. After his discharge, she'd encouraged him to establish a civilian practice that would allow him to help animals without the pressure and trauma of combat conditions. For a while, that approach had worked. Wade had found satisfaction in treating ranch animals and domestic pets, problems that usually had clear solutions and positive outcomes. But even that had become too much after Sarah's death, when his own grief made him too vulnerable to absorb the pain of others. Now, caring for Echo, Wade felt those old protective instincts stirring again. But this time was different. This wasn't about treating injuries caused by accident or natural causes. This was about confronting deliberate cruelty, about standing up to people who use their power and resources to harm creatures that couldn't fight back. The phone call from Rebecca came on a Thursday evening while Wade was conducting Echo's daily examination. He almost didn't answer. His daughter's calls had become predictable exercises in mutual worry and careful avoidance of difficult topics. But something in her voice when he finally picked up suggested this conversation might be different. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right. Are you doing okay?" "Really okay? I mean, not just the standard answer you always give me." Wade paused, his hands stilling on Echo's fur. How could he explain that he was simultaneously more worried and more engaged than he'd been in years? That he'd stumbled into something that demanded the kind of moral courage he'd thought he'd lost forever. "I'm working on something," he said finally. "Something that matters. What kind of something?" "The kind that your mother would have wanted me to work on." There was silence on Rebecca's end, and Wade could imagine her processing this unexpected reference to Sarah. They rarely talked about her mother directly, both of them too afraid of reopening wounds that had never properly healed. "Dad, that sounds both wonderful and terrifying." "It is both of those things. Do you want to talk about it?" Wade looked down at Echo, who was watching him with those amber eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge for such a young creature. "Not yet, but maybe soon." After they hung up, Wade sat in the barn with Echo curled in his lap, listening to the desert wind and thinking about the choices that lay ahead. For 10 years, he'd chosen safety over engagement, protection over risk, isolation over connection. But Echo had changed the equation. Her presence in his life was proof that the world still contained cruelty that needed to be confronted, suffering that needed to be acknowledged, and creatures that needed someone to stand up for them. The veterinary kit sat open on the table beside him, its instruments gleaming under the barn lights. Wade had spent years trying to forget what those tools represented, not just technical skill, but a commitment to healing that sometimes required fighting those who caused harm. Tomorrow, he would continue his investigation into the companies operating in his valley. Tonight, he would simply hold this small survivor and remember what it felt like to be needed by something innocent and alive. The geological survey map had been hanging in Wade's barn office for 15 years, a relic from the early days when he and Sarah had explored every canyon and ridge in their valley. The map, dated from 1987, produced by the U.S. Geological Survey as part of a comprehensive study of the region's mineral resources and groundwater systems. What made it invaluable was its detailed notation of cave systems, underground water sources, and the kind of topographical features that modern satellite imagery couldn't reveal. Wade spread the map across his kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs while Echo watched from her perch on the windowsill. Over the past week, he'd marked the locations where Dolores had noticed unusual truck traffic, using red pins to identify patterns that weren't immediately obvious from ground level. When viewed from above, those patterns told a different story. The activity wasn't random. Vehicle routes connected a series of remote canyons and ridges that shared specific characteristics. They were isolated, accessible by back roads that didn't appear on standard maps, and situated above underground cave systems that could provide natural concealment for facilities that weren't meant to be found. Wade's finger traced the network of marked locations, his mind automatically analyzing the tactical advantages of each site. His army training had included courses in facility security and terrain analysis, skills he'd assumed he'd never need again. But looking at this map, Wade felt those old patterns of thought reasserting themselves with uncomfortable clarity. "They're using the caves," he said aloud, causing Echo to turn her head toward him with the alert attention she'd learned during her captivity. Building facilities underground where they can't be spotted by aerial surveillance. That evening, Wade loaded copper into his horse trailer and drove to a trailhead 20 miles south of his ranch. The ostensible purpose was to check on a fence line for a neighbor, but Wade's real objective was reconnaissance. If Apex was operating multiple facilities in the area, he needed to understand the scope of their operation before deciding how to proceed. The trail led through high desert country toward a series of ridges that overlooked Copper Canyon. Wade had ridden this route many times over the years, but tonight he noticed details that had previously escaped his attention. Fresh tire tracks on old mining roads, surveyors' flags that marked boundaries for projects he'd never heard about. Most tellingly, a subtle change in the behavior of the wildlife, fewer animals than usual, and those he did see seemed nervous, watchful in ways that suggested human activity in areas that should have been undisturbed. Echo rode in a small carrier attached to his saddle, an arrangement that had taken several days to perfect. Wade had been surprised to discover that she seemed to enjoy the movement and elevation, her amber eyes scanning the landscape with the focused attention of a predator. But as they approached the ridgeline overlooking Copper Canyon, Echo's behavior changed dramatically. She became agitated, vocalizing with soft chirping sounds that escalated to distressed yowls as they drew closer to the canyon rim. Wade had seen enough traumatized animals to recognize the signs. Echo was experiencing something like a panic response, triggered by environmental cues that reminded her of her captivity. "Easy, little one," Wade murmured. But Echo's distress continued until he turned Copper away from the canyon and headed back toward the trailer. From the ridge, Wade had been able to see what Dolores had described: security lighting that illuminated areas where no facilities should exist, and the kind of vehicle activity that suggested ongoing operations rather than abandoned mining claims. But Echo's reaction provided a different kind of confirmation. She recognized this place, or places like it, and what she remembered was traumatic enough to overwhelm her usual composure. The next morning, Wade called Dr. Reed again, this time with more specific questions about the technology he'd found embedded in Echo's ear. Marcus listened to Wade's detailed description, asking technical questions that revealed his deep knowledge of current animal research methods. "What you're describing sounds like a neural interface device," Marcus said when Wade finished. "Highly sophisticated, probably worth more than most people make in a year." They're used in experimental programs that monitor brain activity and potentially influence behavior through electrical stimulation. Influence behavior how? Depends on the specific application. Some research focuses on conditioning responses to external stimuli. Others work on modifying aggressive or territorial instincts. There's also military interest in devices that could enhance tracking abilities or improve trainability. Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Are we talking about mind control? Not in the science fiction sense, but yes, technologies that can modify how animals think and behave. The ethical oversight for this kind of research is supposed to be very strict, but private companies with military contracts sometimes operate under different rules. What would happen if animals with these devices were released into wild populations? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Nothing good. Depending on the modifications, you could see changes in breeding patterns, territorial behavior, predator-prey relationships. If the technology malfunctioned or had unintended effects, it could destabilize entire ecosystems. After the call, Wade sat in his kitchen feeling the weight of implications he was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just about animal cruelty, though that was bad enough. This was about reckless experimentation that could have consequences extending far beyond the individual animals involved. He was contemplating his next move when he heard an unfamiliar vehicle approaching his ranch. Through the window, Wade saw a battered pickup truck with Native American tribal plates, driven by a man he didn't immediately recognize. The driver parked near the barn and walked toward the house with the confident stride of someone who belonged in the landscape. Tom Yazzie introduced himself as a wildlife photographer working on a project, documenting the valley's ecosystem. He was probably 45, lean and weathered in the way of people who spent most of their time outdoors, with the kind of patient demeanor that came from years of waiting for perfect shots of elusive animals. "I've been noticing some unusual patterns in animal behavior over the past few months," Tom said, accepting the coffee Wade offered and settling into a kitchen chair with easy familiarity. Animals avoiding areas they normally frequent, changes in feeding patterns, some species disappearing from traditional habitats entirely. Wade studied Tom carefully, wondering how much he could safely reveal. What kind of changes? Predators and prey animals, both showing stress behaviors in areas where they should feel secure. Birds avoiding flight paths they've used for generations. Small mammals abandoning dens and nesting sites for no apparent reason. Tom pulled out a digital camera and scrolled through a series of images. "I've been documenting it, but I can't figure out what's causing the disruption." The photographs were striking. Animals in distress, abandoned territories, behavioral anomalies that Tom had captured with the skill of someone who understood wildlife patterns intimately. But what caught Wade's attention were the locations where the photographs had been taken. They corresponded almost exactly with the areas he'd marked on his geological survey map. "Have you noticed any unusual human activity in those areas?" Wade asked. Tom's expression sharpened. "You know something about this?" It wasn't a question, and Wade found himself making a decision that would change everything that followed. "Maybe, but if I share what I know, you need to understand that it might be dangerous information." Over the next hour, Wade explained what he'd discovered about Echo and the evidence of systematic animal experimentation in the valley. Tom listened without interruption, his photographer's eye taking in details that confirmed Wade's growing understanding of the situation's scope. "I've seen vehicles near some of those locations," Tom said when Wade finished. "Expensive SUVs with tinted windows, driven by people who don't look like researchers or technicians. More like security personnel." "Security for what?" "That's what we need to find out." The alliance formed naturally, two men who understood the valley's natural rhythms and recognized that something fundamental was being disrupted. Tom had access to areas that would be difficult for Wade to reach alone, and his photography equipment could document evidence that might otherwise be dismissed as speculation. Wade brought medical knowledge and military training that could help them understand what they were really dealing with. Their first joint reconnaissance mission came 3 days later. when Tom suggested they investigate an area where he'd noticed particularly severe disruption in animal populations. They approached on foot from a direction that wouldn't be visible from the access roads, moving with the careful patience of hunters who understood that haste was often the enemy of success. What they found was a loading area disguised as a mining operation, complete with trucks that matched Dolores's description and security personnel who were definitely not miners. Wade and Tom were photographing the operation from concealment when one of the guards spotted the reflection from Tom's telephoto lens. The confrontation that followed was brief but revealing. The security team was professional, well-equipped, and clearly accustomed to dealing with unwanted visitors. They confiscated Tom's camera memory cards and informed both men that they were trespassing on private property. When Wade pointed out that the area was supposed to be public land, the lead guard smiled without warmth and suggested they check their maps more carefully. "You folks might want to find other places to do your bird watching," the guard said as he returned their identification. "Some areas around here aren't as safe as they used to be." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. As they walked back to Tom's truck, Wade felt his military training asserting itself in ways he'd hoped never to experience again. He found himself automatically noting the guards' weapons, their communication equipment, their tactical positioning. These weren't rent-a-cops hired to keep teenagers from vandalizing equipment. These were professionals with serious resources backing them. "Well, that settles one question," Tom said as they drove away. "Whatever they're doing, it's big enough to justify that level of security." Wade nodded, but he was thinking about something else. The ease with which the guards had claimed authority over public land suggested influence that extended beyond corporate resources. Someone had enough political or legal power to redraw boundaries and redefine property rights without public notice or oversight. That night, as Wade sat in his barn with Echo purring in his lap, he thought about the choices that lay ahead. The simple act of caring for an injured animal had led him into a situation that demanded skills he'd hoped never to use again. But Echo's presence reminded him why those skills mattered. Someone had to stand up for creatures that couldn't protect themselves, even when standing up meant accepting risks that a prudent man would avoid. The geological survey map lay spread across his workbench, marked now with locations that represented more than academic interest. Wade realized he was planning an investigation that could easily become a war, and the opponent had resources and ruthlessness that made victory far from certain. But as he looked down at Echo, healthy now and trusting, Wade knew he'd already made his choice. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the odds. The surveillance routine Wade and Tom established over the following weeks felt uncomfortably familiar to Wade. The careful planning, the attention to wind direction and sight lines, the patient waiting that characterized military reconnaissance. They worked in shifts, Tom using his photographer's knowledge of the terrain to identify observation points, while Wade applied tactical analysis to understand the patterns of activity they documented. What emerged from their observations was more systematic and extensive than either man had initially imagined. Apex wasn't operating a single facility. They were running a network of connected sites throughout the valley, each serving different functions in what appeared to be a comprehensive research and testing program. The main laboratory complex was hidden in Copper Canyon, built into natural cave systems and concealed from aerial observation by carefully constructed camouflage. But Wade and Tom discovered at least 4 additional sites: a breeding facility where animals were apparently housed before testing, a medical facility for surgical procedures, a behavioral conditioning center, and most disturbing, a disposal site where animals were released or abandoned after experimentation. Tom's telephoto lenses captured details that painted a grim picture of the disposal process. Animals in obvious distress, some bearing visible surgical scars, others displaying the kind of behavioral abnormalities that suggested neurological damage. The releases weren't random. They followed a pattern that suggested the animals were being tracked after disposal, their post-release behavior monitored, as part of extended studies. They're treating the entire valley as a laboratory, Tom said, as they reviewed photographs from their latest surveillance mission. The wild population is becoming part of their experiment. Wade studied an image that showed a coyote stumbling in circles, its movement suggesting severe neurological dysfunction. How many animals are we talking about? Based on what I've documented over the past month? Dozens, maybe hundreds. And that's just what I've been able to photograph. The actual numbers could be much higher. The scope of the operation was staggering, but what troubled Wade most was the evidence of military applications in the research. Equipment they'd observed suggested studies of enhanced sensory capabilities, modified aggressive responses, and something that looked disturbingly like experiments in remote behavioral control. The neural interface devices weren't just monitoring animal behavior, they were actively modifying it. Wade found confirmation of his worst fears when they discovered a small dump site where obsolete equipment had been carelessly discarded. Among the debris, Tom spotted a damaged laptop that had been thrown away rather than properly destroyed. The hard drive was encrypted, but Wade's military experience included basic training in intelligence gathering and data recovery. It took 3 days of careful work, but Wade finally managed to access fragments of the laptop's contents. What he found there made him wish he'd never succeeded. Partial research reports, fragments of email communications, and most damning preliminary results from studies that explicitly referenced military applications for enhanced animal assets and biological force multipliers. The animals weren't just test subjects, they were being turned into weapons. 1. Partially recovered document detailed experiments in aggressive response enhancement designed to create attack animals that could be deployed against human targets. Another described research into sensory augmentation protocols that would enhance tracking abilities beyond natural limits. Most chilling was a fragment that referenced remote behavioral override systems that would allow handlers to control animal actions from significant distances. Dear God, Wade muttered as he scrolled through the recovered data. They're trying to build an army of modified predators. The implications were terrifying. If Apex succeeded in perfecting these technologies, they could potentially deploy animals as weapons that would be virtually impossible to defend against. A wolf pack with enhanced aggression and remote control capabilities could devastate military units. Modified birds with surveillance technology could provide intelligence-gathering capabilities that no conventional system could match. But the research was also clearly experimental and unstable. Many of the test animals showed signs of severe neurological damage after modification procedures. Others displayed unpredictable behavior that made them dangerous to both targets and handlers. The disposal site wasn't just evidence of callousness, it was proof that the technology wasn't working as intended. And Apex was dumping their failures into the wild population rather than acknowledging the program's problems. Wade was documenting the laptop's contents when his phone rang with a call from Rebecca. He almost didn't answer. His daughter's calls had become increasingly concerned over the past few weeks, and Wade wasn't sure how much he could tell her without putting her in danger. "Dad, I'm worried about you," Rebecca said without preamble. "You sound different when we talk, more stressed, more distracted." "And Tom Yazzie called me." Wade's blood chilled. "Tom called you? How did he get your number?" "He said you gave it to him as an emergency contact. He's concerned that you're getting involved in something dangerous, and he thinks you need family support." Wade closed his eyes, realizing that Tom had made a decision without consulting him. It was probably the right decision. Rebecca was a nurse, trained to handle crisis situations, and she had resources in Denver that might prove valuable. But it also meant that Wade could no longer protect her from the knowledge of what he was dealing with. "Rebecca, I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you might sound impossible, but I need you to trust that I know what I'm talking about." Over the next hour, Wade explained everything: Echo's discovery, the evidence of systematic animal experimentation, the scope of Apex's operations, and the military applications that made the research particularly dangerous. Rebecca listened without interruption, her medical training helping her understand the technical aspects of what Wade described. "Dad, this sounds like the kind of thing that should be reported to federal authorities. Why haven't you contacted the FBI or the Department of Defense?" "Because I'm not sure who we can trust. Operation this size, with this level of security, requires significant political and legal protection. If we go to the wrong people, we might end up warning the very officials who are supposed to be providing oversight." "What about Dr. Reed? Can he help?" Wade had been wondering the same thing. His next call to Marcus revealed both good news and bad news. The good news was that Marcus had contacts within the military's Animal Research Oversight Division who could potentially investigate Apex's operations. The bad news was that any official investigation would take months to organize and might be compromised by political considerations. "Wade, what you're describing represents a clear violation of military research protocols," Marcus explained. "But Apex probably has contracts that provide legal cover for their activities, at least on paper. Proving violations would require access to classified materials and testimony from people who are unlikely to cooperate voluntarily. What about the animals being released into wild populations? That has to violate environmental protection laws." "Probably, but again, proving it would require evidence that connects specific animals to specific research programs. The neural interface devices might provide that evidence, but only if we can demonstrate they're being used for prohibited purposes." Wade realized they were facing a classic military problem. They had tactical intelligence about an ongoing operation, but lacked the political authority or legal standing to act on that intelligence through official channels. The evidence they'd gathered was compelling but circumstantial. What they needed was definitive proof that would force authorities to act regardless of political considerations. That proof might exist in Apex's main laboratory, but obtaining it would require direct action that crossed the line from investigation to criminal activity. Wade understood that he was approaching a decision point that would determine not just his own future, but potentially the safety of everyone he cared about. The decision was made for him 3 days later when Tom called with urgent news. Corporate security vehicles had been seen near Wade's ranch, and neighbors reported seeing surveillance teams in the area. Apex had identified Wade as a threat and was moving to neutralize that threat before he could cause further problems. "They know who you are and what you've been doing," Tom said. "I think we're past the point where careful investigation is going to be enough." Wade looked down at Echo, who was sleeping peacefully in her favorite spot near the wood stove. In the weeks since he'd found her, she'd grown stronger and more confident, her natural Bobcat instincts gradually reasserting themselves over the conditioning she'd received in captivity. She represented hope, proof that damage could be healed, that trust could be rebuilt. The creatures subjected to cruelty could recover their essential nature given patience and care, but she also represented everything that was at stake in the larger battle Wade now found himself fighting. If Apex succeeded in perfecting their animal modification technologies, there would be thousands of creatures like Echo, but without the chance for rescue and rehabilitation. The wild populations of the valley would become experimental subjects in a program that treated living beings as expendable, resources in pursuit of military advantage. Wade made his decision with the clarity that comes when moral imperatives override practical considerations. He would gather the evidence needed to expose Apex's operations, even if doing so required actions that his law-abiding nature found repugnant. Some fights were too important to lose simply because the enemy had legal advantages and superior resources. "Tom," Wade said into the phone, "I think it's time we stop playing defense." That night, Wade cleaned and checked his rifle for the first time in years. The familiar weight of the weapon bringing back memories he'd hoped were permanently buried. Tomorrow, he would begin planning an operation that would either expose the truth about Apex's activities or destroy any chance he had of living peacefully in the valley he'd called home for 15 years. Either way, there would be no going back to the careful isolation he'd maintained since Sarah's death. Echo had changed everything, and Wade was finally ready to accept the responsibilities that came with caring about something beyond his own. Safety. The photograph that broke Wade's resolve to proceed cautiously was discovered in a damaged computer tablet Tom found near one of the disposal sites. The device had been cracked and water-damaged, apparently thrown from a vehicle during one of the equipment disposal runs. Most of its memory was corrupted, but Wade managed to recover a single image that showed the interior of what appeared to be the main laboratory facility. Dozens of animals in metal cages, stacked floor to ceiling in clinical precision. The photograph was clinical in its documentation. Numbered cages, monitoring equipment, sterile lighting that cast harsh shadows across creatures that huddled in corners or stared with the blank hopelessness of prolonged captivity. Wade recognized species from throughout the region: coyotes, foxes, bobcats, mountain lions, even what appeared to be several black bears in larger enclosures. But what made the photograph devastating was its casual nature. This wasn't documentation of emergency treatment or temporary housing. This was a production facility, organized for efficiency and volume rather than animal welfare. The creatures in those cages weren't patients, they were inventory. Wade stared at the image on his computer screen for a long time, feeling something inside him break and reform into something harder and more determined. He'd spent years treating wounded animals, but he'd never seen anything that approached the scale of suffering documented in this single photograph. The clinical efficiency of the operation was somehow more disturbing than outright cruelty would have been. "How many?" he asked aloud, though Echo was the only one present to hear him. "How many animals have they processed through that place?" The question haunted him through the following days, as evidence of Apex's expanding operations became impossible to ignore. Dolores mentioned increased helicopter traffic during her evening visits, always flying the same routes toward the canyon areas Wade and Tom had identified as research sites. Local ranchers reported missing livestock, not the kind of predation losses that were normal for the region, but animals that simply disappeared without trace or evidence. Most disturbing were the reports from pet owners in the small towns surrounding the valley. Dogs and cats that had vanished from their yards, often animals that were too well trained or too domesticated to simply run away. The pattern suggested systematic collection rather than random theft, as if someone was gathering subjects with specific characteristics for specific purposes. Wade's sleep became troubled by dreams that mixed memories of his military service with images from the laboratory photograph. He would find himself back in field hospitals in Afghanistan, treating working dogs that had been wounded by roadside bombs, their trust in human handlers unshaken despite the pain they'd endured. The contrast between those animals' loyalty and the hopeless resignation he'd seen in the laboratory photograph created a cognitive dissonance that left him exhausted and angry. The escalation in Apex's response to their investigation became personal when Tom discovered that his photography equipment had been sabotaged. Someone had broken into his truck during what should have been a routine surveillance mission, damaging his cameras and stealing memory cards that contained weeks of documentation. The break-in was professional, no random vandalism, but precise destruction designed to eliminate specific evidence while leaving other valuable equipment untouched. "They know exactly what we've been doing," Tom said, as he surveyed the damage. "This wasn't opportunistic theft. Someone targeted the specific equipment I've been using to document their operations." The message was clear. Apex was moving from passive observation of Wade and Tom's activities to active interference. The next step would likely be direct confrontation, a point where half measures and careful investigation would no longer be sufficient. His decision to involve Dr. Reed more directly came after a sleepless night spent staring at the laboratory photograph and thinking, about the animals it represented. Marcus had the contacts and credentials needed to bring federal attention to Apex's operations. But involving him would also put his career and potentially his safety at risk. Marcus, I need to send you something, but I want you to understand that looking at it might create obligations you'd rather not have, Wade said during their next phone conversation. Wade, I've been in military research oversight for 15 years. I've seen things that would give civilian veterinarians nightmares. What could you possibly show me that would be worse than what I've already dealt with? Wade transmitted the laboratory photograph, along with the fragments of research data he'd recovered from the damaged laptop. Marcus was silent for a long time after reviewing the materials, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Wade recognized from their army days, the tone of an officer processing information that changed everything about a mission. Wade, this is worse than I thought. If these images are authentic, they represent clear violations of federal research protocols and animal welfare laws. But more than that, the scale of the operation suggests funding and authorization at levels that should have triggered multiple oversight reviews. What does that mean? It means someone with significant political influence has been protecting this program from the kind of scrutiny it should have received. The military applications you've identified aren't just unethical. They're potentially illegal under international treaties governing biological weapons. Research. Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. Biological weapons. Modified animals deployed as attack assets would fall under biological weapons conventions if they were intended for military use against human targets. If Apex is receiving military funding for this research, they're potentially violating international law. The conversation was interrupted by a call from Rebecca announcing that she'd taken vacation time and was driving down from Denver to visit him. Wade tried to dissuade her, but his daughter had inherited both her parents' stubborn streak and her mother's instinct for when people needed help, whether they wanted it or not. Dad, you sound like you're carrying the weight of the world, and Tom thinks you're going to do something dangerous and stupid. I'm coming down to make sure you don't get yourself killed trying to be a hero. Rebecca, this isn't a situation where this isn't a negotiation. I'll be there tomorrow evening, and we're going to figure out a solution that doesn't involve you taking on a corporation with military connections, using nothing but righteous indignation and a rifle. After she hung up, Wade sat in his kitchen feeling the complexity of his situation multiply exponentially. Rebecca's presence would provide emotional support and potentially valuable assistance. Her medical training and analytical mind could be invaluable in understanding the research data they'd collected. But it would also mean that everyone he cared about would be directly exposed to the risks he'd been trying to manage alone. That night, Wade received the first direct threat, a phone call to his landline at 11 o'clock. The voice synthesized and electronically altered, but the message unmistakably clear. Mr. Merritt, you've been taking an unhealthy interest in private business operations in your area. We'd like to suggest that you focus your attention on your own affairs. Continued interference with legitimate research activities could result in unfortunate consequences for you and your family. The caller hung up before Wade could respond, but the message was already delivered. They knew who he was, what he'd been doing, and they were willing to threaten his family to stop him. The casual mention of Rebecca confirmed that they'd been monitoring his communications and were prepared to escalate their response if he continued his investigation. Wade stood by his kitchen window, looking out at the desert night and thinking about choices that seemed to be narrowing with each day that passed. Echo padded into the kitchen and rubbed against his legs, her purr a small sound of contentment in the growing darkness. She'd been with him for 6 weeks now, long enough to grow from a traumatized kitten into a young bobcat, beginning to reclaim her natural instincts. Her recovery had become a symbol of something larger for Wade, proof that damage could be healed, that trust could be rebuilt, that even creatures subjected to the worst human cruelty could find their way back to wholeness given patience and care. But her recovery also reminded him of all the animals still trapped in that clinical hell he'd seen in the photograph. Creatures that would never have the chance for healing unless someone was willing to fight for them. The threat to his family changed the moral calculus. Wade could accept risks to himself in pursuit of justice for voiceless creatures, but he couldn't accept risks to Rebecca or others he cared about. Yet walking away from the investigation would mean abandoning hundreds of animals to continued suffering and allowing apex to perfect technologies that could eventually threaten far more than the local ecosystem. Wade realized he was facing the kind of decision that had defined the most important moments of his life. Moments when moral clarity demanded action regardless of personal cost. His military service had taught him that some fights were worth having even when victory wasn't guaranteed. Sarah's death had taught him that avoiding risk didn't protect you from loss. Echo's recovery had reminded him that healing was possible, but only when someone was willing to stand up to those who caused harm. As he watched Echo settle into her favorite sleeping spot near the wood stove, Wade made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would gather the evidence needed to expose Apex's operations, but he would do it in a way that protected the people he cared about, while ensuring that the truth couldn't be suppressed or ignored. Tomorrow, Rebecca would arrive and become part of a battle she hadn't chosen, but that her conscience wouldn't let her avoid. Together, they would find a way to save the animals in that photograph and stop a research program that treated living beings as expendable resources in pursuit of military advantage. Wade touched the dog tags under his shirt and felt the weight of responsibility settle around his shoulders like a familiar coat. Some battles chose you rather than the other way around, and this was clearly one of them. The only question now was whether he still had the courage and skill to fight a war he'd hoped never to face again. Dr. Marcus Reed arrived at Wade's ranch just after dawn, driving a nondescript rental car and carrying a duffel bag that suggested he planned to stay longer than a social visit would require. Wade met him at the gate, feeling the complex emotions that came with seeing an old friend under circumstances that neither of them had anticipated. Marcus looked older than his 55 years, his hair more grey than Wade remembered, his face carrying the kind of weariness that came from too many years dealing with bureaucracy and classified horrors. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made him Wade's closest friend during their army service. "You look like hell," Marcus said by way of greeting. "When was the last time you slept more than 4 hours at a stretch?" "About 6 weeks ago, when my life was simpler, and I thought the worst thing I had to worry about was a bad knee and too much solitude." Marcus followed Wade into the house, where Echo was eating breakfast with the focused attention of a creature that had learned not to take regular meals for granted. Marcus studied the young Bobcat with professional interest, noting the scars Wade had described and the behavioral markers that suggested extensive conditioning. "She's beautiful," Marcus said, "and she's been through hell. The neural interface implant is more sophisticated than anything I've seen in military applications. We're talking about technology that's probably 5 years ahead of anything the official research programs have developed." Wade poured coffee and settled across from Marcus at the kitchen table. "How much did you find out about Apex Biosolutions?" Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up files that made Wade's stomach tighten with recognition. Corporate organizational charts, research contracts, personnel records, the kind of comprehensive intelligence gathering that required significant resources and high-level security clearances. "Apex is bigger than we thought," Marcus began. "They have contracts with multiple military agencies, totaling over $200 million in funding over the past 5 years. But here's what's interesting. Most of their research is classified under biological defense programs, which gives them exemptions from normal animal welfare oversight." "Biological defense," Wade repeated. "You mean biological weapons?" "Officially, they're developing countermeasures against potential biological threats. Unofficially, the research you've documented suggests they're developing the threats themselves. Modified animals with enhanced aggressive capabilities, neural control systems, sensory augmentation, that's offensive capability, not defensive research. Wade studied the documents Marcus had brought. His military training, helping him interpret the bureaucratic language that concealed disturbing realities. Funding authorizations for animal asset development. Research proposals for enhanced biological reconnaissance. Platforms, technical specifications for remote behavioral modification systems. The terminology was designed to obscure the fundamental truth that Apex was trying to turn animals into weapons, but it was the personnel, files that made Wade's blood run cold. Sarah's name appeared in multiple documents. Her PhD credentials and research experience listed among the consulting scientists who had provided technical expertise for Apex's program development. Marcus, Wade said slowly. My wife's name is in these files. Marcus nodded grimly. That's why I drove down here instead of sending this information electronically. Wade, Sarah wasn't just aware of Apex's research, she was actively involved in the early stages of their program development. The words hit Wade like a physical blow. For 10 years, he'd carried the memory of Sarah as a dedicated researcher, committed to healing and scientific progress. The idea that she'd been involved with the kind of systematic cruelty he'd discovered was almost impossible to accept. There has to be a mistake. Sarah would never have participated in anything like what we've documented. Marcus pulled out another file, this one marked with security classifications that suggested it contained highly sensitive information. She didn't participate willingly. According to these records, Sarah was recruited as a biochemistry consultant for what she thought was legitimate pharmaceutical research. By the time she discovered the true nature of the program, she was legally bound by security agreements that prevented her from discussing it openly. The file contained email communications between Sarah and Apex administrators, messages that revealed her growing horror as she learned about the animal experimentation and her desperate attempts to extract herself from the program. Wade recognized his wife's writing style in messages that became increasingly urgent and angry as she tried to find ways to expose what she'd discovered. She was trying to blow the whistle, Wade said, reading through communications that painted a picture of a woman trapped between legal obligations and moral imperatives. She was building a case that would have exposed the entire program. Look at the dates on these messages. She was gathering evidence and preparing to contact federal authorities when she became ill. Wade studied the timeline Marcus had constructed, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Sarah's illness had begun just weeks after her most confrontational communications with Apex, developing with a rapidity that had surprised her oncologists. The cancer had been aggressive and resistant to treatment, characteristics that were unusual but not impossible in naturally occurring diseases. You think they killed her? Wade said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. I think she posed a threat to a program worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and she died before she could act on that threat. Draw your own conclusions. Wade stood and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape where he and Sarah had planned to grow old together. The possibility that her death had been deliberate transformed his grief into something harder and more focused, a rage that had been building for weeks, but now had a specific target. If they killed Sarah to protect their research program, why wait 10 years to come after me? Because you weren't a threat until you found Echo. Wade, look at this. Marcus pointed to a technical specification in one of the files. The neural interface devices aren't just monitoring equipment. They're recording everything the animals experience: visual data, auditory input, behavioral responses, environmental conditions. Echo's implant contains a complete record of her captivity and experimentation. The implications hit Wade immediately. Echo wasn't just a survivor of Apex's program. She was a walking database that could provide evidence of everything that had been done to her and potentially to other animals in the program. If the right experts could decode the information stored in her neural implant, it would provide irrefutable proof of the systematic cruelty and illegal research Apex had been conducting. "They need her back," Wade said. "Not just to eliminate evidence, but to retrieve the data she's carrying. And they need to eliminate anyone who might know how to interpret that data. Wade, your veterinary background and military experience make you uniquely qualified to understand what they've been doing and to present evidence in ways that authorities couldn't ignore." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch, multiple engines, moving fast over the gravel road that led to Wade's property. Wade looked out the window and felt his military training assert itself with uncomfortable familiarity. 3 black SUVs were approaching his house, the kind of official-looking vehicles that suggested either law enforcement or corporate security with law enforcement cooperation. "Get down," Wade said to Marcus, moving away from the window and retrieving the rifle he'd cleaned the night before. "And call Tom. Tell him to stay away from here." Marcus was already on his phone when Wade heard Echo make a sound he'd never heard from her before, a low, sustained growl that spoke of recognition and fear. She'd seen these vehicles before, or ones like them, and what she remembered was traumatic enough to overcome her usual composure. "Wade," Marcus said urgently. "Tom's not answering his phone, and Rebecca just texted that she's 30 minutes out. They're coordinating this to catch everyone together." Wade felt the tactical situation crystallizing in his mind with the clarity that came from years of military training. Apex's security team was moving to eliminate witnesses and recover evidence, timing their operation to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing potential complications. They'd identified everyone connected to Wade's investigation and were planning to deal with all of them simultaneously. The first SUV stopped 50 yards from the house, positioning itself to block the main access road. The second vehicle moved to cover the back of the property, while the third stopped near the barn in a position that would allow its occupants to control movement between the house and outbuildings. "Professional deployment, suggesting military or law enforcement training. How many rounds do you have for that rifle?" Marcus asked, pulling a pistol from his duffel bag that suggested his visit hadn't been entirely social. "Enough," Wade replied, checking the magazine and feeling muscle memory take over. "But this isn't Afghanistan, and those probably aren't enemy combatants. We need to be very careful about what lines we cross here." The tactical radio chatter they could hear from the vehicles suggested the security team was coordinating their approach, probably waiting for additional units or specific authorization before proceeding. That gave Wade a brief window to think through options that had become severely limited. He could surrender and hope that legal processes would eventually sort out the truth. But Sarah's death suggested that Apex had resources and influence that extended into official channels. He could attempt to escape with Echo and the evidence they'd gathered, but that would mean abandoning Tom and potentially putting Rebecca in danger when she arrived. Or he could make a stand here, using the tactical advantages of familiar terrain to protect the people and animals he cared about, while hoping that Marcus's official connections could bring federal attention to the situation. The choice was made for him when Scout began barking frantically from the barn, the sound interrupted by a yelp that suggested someone had silenced the old dog with more force than necessary. Wade felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. These people had come onto his property and hurt his dog, crossing a line that transformed a complex situation into something much simpler. "Marcus, get on the radio to every federal contact you have. Tell them we're under attack by a corporate security team, and we have evidence of illegal animal experimentation and possible murder. Tell them if they want that evidence, they need to get here fast." Wade moved to the gun cabinet and retrieved additional weapons and ammunition, his movements economical and precise. 10 years of civilian life hadn't erased the skills that had kept him alive in much more dangerous situations than this one. What about Rebecca? She's a combat nurse. She's been in worse situations than this. And she's the one person here who might be able to keep us alive if this goes badly. Outside, the security teams were moving into position, their tactical discipline suggesting they weren't planning to take prisoners or leave witnesses. Wade looked down at Echo, who was pressed against his leg in a mixture of terror and trust, and felt the weight of all the choices that had led to this moment. Sarah had died, trying to expose the truth about Apex's research program. Wade could honor her memory by completing the mission she'd started, or he could surrender and allow her killers to cover up their crimes permanently. When the choice was framed that way, there was really only one decision a man of conscience could make. "All right, Sarah," Wade said quietly, chambering around and moving toward the window. "Let's finish what you started." The standoff lasted 4 hours, ending not with violence, but with the arrival of federal agents summoned by Marcus's emergency contacts. The corporate security teams retreated when faced with FBI vehicles and Department of Defense investigators, but not before Wade understood that this confrontation was merely a tactical withdrawal, not a strategic defeat. "They'll be back," Wade told Marcus as they watched the black SUVs disappear down the valley road. "This was reconnaissance as much as intimidation. They know our capabilities now, and they'll adjust their approach accordingly." The federal agents took statements and collected preliminary evidence, but Wade could see the political calculations happening in real time. Apex's military contracts and security classifications created complications that would take weeks or months to sort through legal channels. Meanwhile, the animals in those laboratory cages would continue to suffer, and the evidence that could expose the full scope of the program would be destroyed or relocated. That evening, Wade made the hardest decision of the entire crisis. He called Dolores and asked her to visit her sister in Phoenix for an extended stay. Tom was easier to convince. The photographer understood that documenting atrocities was worthless if you didn't survive to share the documentation with people who could act on it. "Take Scout with you," Wade told Tom as they transferred the injured border collie to the photographer's truck. The old dog's leg had been broken during the security team's search of the barn, but the veterinarian in Tonopah had confirmed that the injury would heal with proper care. He's earned a vacation from all this excitement. Rebecca arrived 2 hours later, driving her Subaru Outback with the focused determination that Wade remembered from her childhood when she'd made up her mind about something important. She listened to his explanation of the day's events with the professional composure of someone accustomed to crisis situations, asking practical questions about immediate safety and long-term strategy. "Dad, I need you to understand something," Rebecca said when he finished briefing her on the situation. "I didn't drive down here to talk you out of this. I came to help you finish it. Rebecca, this isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. If they killed Mom to cover up their research program, then it became my fight the moment she died. I've spent 10 years watching you blame yourself for not being able to save her. And now we find out that her death might have been preventable if someone had been willing to stand up to these people sooner." Wade looked at his daughter and saw Sarah's determination combined with a steel he'd forgotten Rebecca possessed. She'd inherited her mother's scientific mind and her father's protective instincts, creating a combination that made her formidable when focused on a specific objective. "What do you propose we do?" "We gather the evidence needed to expose Apex's operations, and we do it in a way that ensures the truth can't be suppressed or ignored. Mom was trying to work within legal channels when they killed her. We're going to work outside those channels until we can force the legal system to act." Marcus spread topographical maps across Wade's kitchen table, marking the locations they'd identified as Apex research facilities. The main laboratory complex in Copper Canyon was the primary target. If they could access the central computer systems and document the full scope of the animal experimentation, they could provide evidence that no amount of political influence could suppress. "The challenge is getting inside," Marcus explained. "The facility is underground, accessed through a single entrance that's heavily monitored. Security systems include motion detectors, thermal imaging, and what appears to be armed personnel on 24-hour shifts. Wade studied the terrain around the canyon, his military training automatically analyzing approach routes and potential vulnerabilities. What about the natural cave systems? The original geological surveys showed extensive underground networks in that area. That's possible, but we'd need detailed maps of the cave systems to identify connection points. And we'd have to assume that Apex has secured or blocked any natural access routes they identified during construction. Rebecca had been quiet during the tactical discussion, but now she spoke up with the kind of insight that reminded Wade of Sarah's analytical abilities. We're thinking about this wrong. We don't need to break into their facility. We need to make them come to us with their evidence. What do you mean? Echo's neural implant contains a complete record of her experiences in their program, right? What if we let them know that we're planning to extract and publish that data? They'd have to move quickly to prevent that information from becoming public. Marcus considered this. They'd probably try to recover Echo and eliminate the witnesses, but they might also accelerate their timeline for destroying evidence at the main facility. If we could monitor their communications, we might be able to predict their actions and intercept critical information. Or, Wade said slowly, we could make them think we'd already extracted Echo's data and were planning to release it publicly. That might force them to evacuate the facility and dispose of the animals before the evidence could be used against them. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was complex and dangerous, requiring coordination between multiple moving parts and precise timing. Marcus would use his federal contacts to ensure that official investigators would be positioned to respond when Apex began destroying evidence. Rebecca would work with Echo to prepare the neural implant data for extraction, using her medical knowledge to minimize trauma to the animal. Wade would conduct surveillance of the main facility, documenting the accelerated disposal operations that their deception would trigger. But the heart of the plan depended on something Wade had found among the recovered. Equipment from Apex's dump site, a burner phone that contained text messages with coordinates and timestamps for scheduled animal disposals. The messages suggested that Apex was planning a major inventory reduction within the next 48 hours. Probably in response to the federal attention their security operations had attracted. They're going to kill everything, Wade said, reading through the messages with growing horror. Every animal in that facility is going to be disposed of before investigators can document what was done to them. Unless we get there first, Rebecca said. Dad, how many animals are we talking about? Wade consulted the laboratory photograph and the intelligence they'd gathered over weeks of surveillance. Based on what we've seen, probably 60 to 80 animals in various stages of experimentation. Most of them will be too damaged by the research procedures to survive in the wild, but some might be savable with proper veterinary care. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on all of them. Even if they could rescue the animals from immediate destruction, many would require euthanasia for humane reasons. Others might be so psychologically damaged by their captivity that rehabilitation would be impossible. But Wade couldn't accept that these creatures should die simply to protect Apex's corporate interests and military contracts. We're not going to save them all, Wade acknowledged, but we might be able to save some. And we can definitely ensure that their suffering isn't hidden from the people who have the authority to prevent this from happening again. Marcus had been working on his laptop during the planning session, reaching out to contacts within federal law enforcement and military oversight agencies. His expression grew increasingly grim as responses came back from his network of professional relationships. We have a problem, Marcus announced. Apex has been anticipating federal investigation and has been moving to secure political protection. They've got Defense Department officials arguing that their research is essential for national security, and they're claiming that any interference would compromise classified programs. What does that mean for us? It means that official channels are going to move slowly, if at all. We might be the only people in position to document what's really happening before the evidence disappears permanently. Wade felt the weight of responsibility settling around his shoulders like a familiar burden. This was the kind of mission he'd hoped never to face again, an operation where failure meant that innocent creatures would suffer and die while their tormentors escaped justice. But it was also the kind of mission that defined what a person truly believed about the relationship between power and responsibility. Rebecca seemed to sense his internal struggle. "Dad, I know this isn't what you wanted when you decided to help one injured animal. But sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences you didn't choose." Wade looked at Echo, who was sleeping peacefully in her carrier, recovering from the stress of the day's confrontation. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a traumatized kitten carrying evidence of systematic cruelty. Now she was a healthy young bobcat whose presence had revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond anything Wade had imagined. Her transformation had become a symbol of what was possible when someone was willing to stand up for creatures that couldn't protect themselves. "All right," Wade said, feeling the decision settle into place with the finality of commitment. "We're going to give Apex something to really worry about. Marcus, how long do you need to get your federal contacts positioned for response?" 12 hours, maybe 18 if I can convince them that the evidence is worth the political risk. Rebecca, how long to prepare Echo's implant data for extraction? 4 hours, assuming I can figure out the interface protocols without damaging the device. Wade checked his watch and calculated timelines that left almost no margin for error. That gives us until tomorrow evening to execute this plan. After that, we either succeed in exposing the truth or we disappear into federal custody while Apex destroys all the evidence and relocates their operations. As they finalized the details of their operation, Wade felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that had characterized the most important missions of his military career. The outcome would determine not just their own futures, but the fate of dozens of animals that had no voice in their own defense. He'd spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation, circumstances that demanded courage and sacrifice, in service of principles that transcended personal safety. But Echo's presence in his life had reminded him that some fights were worth having regardless of the personal cost, and some responsibilities couldn't be avoided simply because accepting them was dangerous. Tomorrow, they would either complete Sarah's mission to expose the truth about Apex's research program, or they would join her as casualties in a war between corporate power and moral conscience. Wade found himself hoping that he still possessed the skills and courage necessary to ensure that Sarah's death would not be in vain. The master key card had been almost too easy to obtain. Wade had expected sophisticated security protocols, but Apex's overconfidence in their remote location and political protection had led to casual handling of access credentials. The card belonged to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a research supervisor whose vehicle Tom had observed during surveillance missions. When she stopped for coffee at the truck stop in Tonopah, it had taken Rebecca less than 5 minutes to clone the card's access codes using equipment Marcus had procured through his federal contacts. Now, at 3 in the morning, Wade crouched at the concealed entrance to Apex's underground facility, feeling the weight of Echo's carrier on his back and the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded direct action. The facility's camouflaged entrance was built into the canyon wall, hidden behind what appeared to be a natural rockfall, but was actually sophisticated construction designed to fool aerial reconnaissance. Rebecca and Tom waited 50 yards behind him, positioned to coordinate with Marcus, who was monitoring security communications from a relay point 2 miles away. The plan required precise timing. Wade would use the cloned access card to enter the facility and begin documenting the animal experimentation while his team gathered evidence and prepared for emergency evacuation. The key card worked flawlessly, opening blast doors that revealed a corridor carved directly into the rock. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows along walls that bore the sterile functionality of a military installation rather than the academic atmosphere Wade had expected from a research facility. The air carried the antiseptic smell of a hospital, mixed with something else, the distinctive odor of fear and confinement that he remembered from the worst military veterinary situations he'd encountered. Wade moved through the corridor with the careful precision of his army training. Echo's carrier secured to his back and his sidearm ready, but holstered. His objective was documentation, not confrontation, but the layout of the facility suggested that avoiding security personnel would be more difficult than anticipated. The main laboratory occupied a vast underground chamber that had been excavated from natural cave systems and reinforced with steel and concrete. What Wade found there exceeded his worst expectations. Hundreds of cages arranged in clinical precision, containing animals in various stages of experimentation and recovery. The scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't a research facility. It was an industrial-level production center for modified animals. Wade activated the video camera Rebecca had provided and began systematic documentation, moving from cage to cage while fighting the nausea that came from witnessing systematic cruelty. Many of the animals bore obvious signs of surgical modification: neural implants, sensory enhancement devices, behavioral control systems that had been installed with little regard for the creature's well-being. But what struck him most powerfully was the animal's response to his presence. Instead of the aggressive fear he'd expected, most displayed the kind of resigned hopelessness that came from prolonged captivity without hope of escape. They'd been broken systematically, their natural instincts replaced by conditioned responses that made them manageable for their captors. "My God," Wade whispered into his radio, "there are over 200 animals down here. Mountain lions, wolves, bears, dozens of smaller predators. They've been running this operation for years." Rebecca's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Dad, you need to move faster. Marcus is picking up increased radio chatter that suggests security personnel are responding to the access." Alert, Wade used his veterinary training to make rapid assessments of which animals might be salvageable and which were too damaged by the experimental procedures to survive outside captivity. The decisions were heartbreaking. Creatures that had once been apex predators reduced to neurological wrecks by procedures that seemed designed more for torture than legitimate research. He was documenting a cage containing 3 wolf pups with obvious brain surgery scars when he heard footsteps in the corridor behind him. Dr. Elizabeth Kane entered the chamber with the confident stride of someone accustomed to absolute authority, flanked by 2 security guards who looked more like military contractors than corporate employees. Dr. Kane was younger than Wade had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of precise bearing that suggested either military background or extensive experience with classified programs. Her expression showed no surprise at finding an intruder in her facility. She'd been expecting this confrontation. "Mr. Merritt," she said with clinical detachment, "I assume you're satisfied with what you've found here. The question now is whether you're prepared to understand the larger implications of our work." Wade continued documenting while positioning himself for potential tactical movement. "I understand that you're torturing animals for military applications that violate international law. We're developing technologies that could save thousands of human lives in future conflicts. Enhanced animal assets could replace human soldiers in the most dangerous reconnaissance and assault missions. The animals you see here are contributing to advances that will revolutionize military capability. By turning them into weapons, by utilizing their natural capabilities in service of human security interests. These animals would live and die in the wild regardless. We're simply ensuring that their lives serve a larger purpose." Wade felt anger building in his chest as he listened to the rationalization that reduced living creatures to expendable resources. "And the animals that don't survive your experiments? What larger purpose do their deaths serve?" Dr. Kane's expression didn't change. Acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic advantages. Mr. Merritt, you're a former military veterinarian. Surely you understand the concept of tactical sacrifice for strategic gain. I understand the difference between treating wounded animals and creating wounded animals. The conversation was interrupted by Rebecca's urgent voice in his earpiece. Dad, you've got security teams moving in from multiple directions. Tom's uploading the facility schematics, but you need to start moving toward the emergency exit now. Wade looked around the chamber, calculating distances and tactical options, while Dr. Kane watched with the patience of someone who believed she held all the advantages. The cloned access card would get him through most security doors, but the sheer size of the facility and the number of animals involved made rescue impossible through conventional means. Dr. Kane, I'm giving you one opportunity to begin humane euthanasia procedures for the animals that are too damaged to survive. In exchange, I'll ensure that your cooperation is noted when federal investigators arrive. Federal investigators don't have jurisdiction over classified defense programs, Mr. Merritt, and you're going to find that leaving this facility is considerably more difficult than entering it was. Wade activated Echo's carrier release, allowing the young Bobcat to emerge into the laboratory chamber. Echo's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She began vocalizing with sounds that were part distress call, part identification signal. Other animals in the facility responded, creating a cacophony that suggested recognition and shared trauma. She remembers this place, Wade said, understanding suddenly why Echo had been so willing to follow him from the desert. She's been trying to lead me back here since the day I found her. Dr. Kane's composure cracked slightly as she watched Echo move through the laboratory with obvious familiarity. That animal contains classified technology. Removing her from this facility constitutes theft of military property. That animal is a survivor of systematic torture, and she's going home. Wade keyed his radio as security personnel began entering the chamber from multiple access points. Rebecca, initiate emergency protocols. We're going to have company very soon. The tactical situation was developing rapidly, with armed security teams moving to surround his position, while Dr. Kane retreated to what appeared to be a secure command area. Wade's military training asserted itself as he evaluated cover options and escape routes. But the underground facility's design favored defenders who knew the layout over intruders, operating with incomplete intelligence. As he prepared for what would likely be the most difficult extraction of his life, Wade looked around the chamber filled with caged animals and felt the weight of responsibility that had driven him to this moment. These creatures couldn't advocate for themselves, couldn't escape their captivity without help, couldn't expose the truth about what had been done to them without someone willing to risk everything in their defense. Echo rubbed against his leg with the trust that had developed over weeks of patient care, and Wade realized that regardless of what happened next, she had already accomplished her mission. She'd led him to this place, shown him the truth about Apex's operations, and provided the evidence needed to expose systematic cruelty. Masquerading as legitimate research now, it was his turn to complete the mission Sarah had started, ensuring that the truth about Apex's program couldn't be hidden or ignored, even if doing so required sacrifices he'd hoped never to make again. The USB drive that would ultimately expose Apex's entire operation was hidden in Dr. Kane's personal workstation, concealed behind false panels that suggested she'd been planning for eventual discovery and prosecution. Wade found it during the final minutes of their confrontation, while Rebecca coordinated the emergency evacuation, and Tom documented evidence that would prove crucial in subsequent federal investigations. Your wife was more persistent than we anticipated, Dr. Kane said as Wade downloaded files from her computer system. She'd assembled a comprehensive case against our program before we were forced to intervene. Wade's hands stilled on the keyboard. Forced to intervene. Sarah had contacted federal oversight agencies and was preparing to release classified information to media outlets. We couldn't allow that kind of security breach, regardless of her motivations. The confirmation of what Wade had suspected hit him like a physical blow. For 10 years, he'd carried guilt about his inability to save Sarah from cancer that had seemed to appear from nowhere and resist every treatment. Now he understood that her death had been deliberately caused by people who viewed murder as an acceptable business expense. How? Wade asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Targeted carcinogens administered through routine medical procedures. Undetectable, essentially untreatable. Designed to appear like aggressive but natural cancer progression. Sarah never suspected that her illness was anything other than terrible luck. Wade felt rage building in his chest, hot, focused anger that demanded immediate action. His military training provided multiple options for neutralizing Dr. Kane and her security personnel, techniques that would be efficient and satisfying. But Rebecca's voice in his earpiece reminded him of larger obligations. Dad, federal agents are moving into position outside the facility. Don't do anything that would compromise the evidence we've gathered. Wade forced himself to continue downloading files while Dr. Kane watched, with the clinical detachment of someone who'd ordered numerous deaths and felt no emotional connection to the consequences. The USB drive filled with research data, correspondence, financial records, and most importantly, detailed documentation of Sarah's investigation and the corporate decision to eliminate her. You're going to prison, Wade said quietly. Not just for what you've done to these animals, but for murdering my wife. I'm going to be protected by federal agencies that depend on our research for national security applications. Your wife was a security risk, Mr. Merritt. Eliminating her was a necessary, operational decision. The security team's advance had been slowed by Rebecca's tactical knowledge and Tom's ability to document their movements while staying ahead of their search pattern. Marcus's coordination with federal agents had created confusion about jurisdiction and authority that gave Wade additional time to complete evidence gathering. But time was running out. Wade could hear security personnel moving closer to the main laboratory, their radio communications suggesting they were prepared to use lethal force to protect the facility's secrets. The choice between personal vengeance and completing the mission was becoming unavoidable. Wade looked around the chamber filled with caged animals and made his decision. Justice for Sarah would come through legal processes, not through actions that would make him a criminal and potentially invalidate the evidence they'd gathered. These animals needed him to complete the mission, not to satisfy his personal need for revenge. Echo, come, Wade called. And the young Bobcat immediately moved to his side with the trust that had developed over months of patient care. We're going home. The extraction from the facility required every skill Wade had learned during his military service. Corporate security personnel were well-trained and heavily armed, but they lacked the tactical flexibility that came from actual combat experience. Wade used the facility's layout against them, employing corridors and chamber entrances to control their movement while protecting his team's escape route. Rebecca proved herself during the evacuation, using her medical training to assess which animals could survive transport while coordinating with Tom to ensure that critical evidence was preserved. Her presence transformed the operation from a desperate gamble into a coordinated effort that maximized both animal rescue and documentation. Dad, I've got 18 animals that might be salvageable with intensive veterinary care, Rebecca reported as they moved toward the emergency exit. The others are too neurologically damaged to survive outside controlled conditions. Wade accepted the harsh mathematics of the situation. They couldn't save every animal in the facility, but they could save some while ensuring that the systematic cruelty was exposed and ended. Sometimes justice required accepting partial victories while working toward larger goals. Tom's photography equipment had captured evidence that would prove devastating in federal court. Images of the laboratory conditions, documentation of specific experimental procedures, recordings of Dr. Kane's admissions about Sarah's murder. Combined with the data Wade had downloaded, they possessed comprehensive proof of illegal research and corporate homicide. The final confrontation came at the facility's concealed entrance, where Dr. Kane made a last attempt to prevent their escape. She'd brought additional security personnel, but Wade's tactical position and the arrival of federal agents created a standoff that favored truth over cover-up. "Dr. Kane," Wade said as FBI vehicles surrounded the entrance, "you were right about one thing. This was always about tactical sacrifice for strategic gain. You just miscalculated who would be making the sacrifice." Federal agents arrested Dr. Kane and her security team, while Wade, Rebecca, and Tom transferred rescued animals to veterinary transport vehicles that Marcus had coordinated. Echo rode in Wade's truck, her amber eyes alert but calm as they left the canyon where she'd been tortured and returned to the desert where Wade had first found her. The USB drive contained everything needed to expose Apex's program and prosecute its leadership for crimes ranging from animal cruelty to federal homicide. Sarah's investigation, completed 10 years after her death, would finally receive the official attention it deserved. As they drove away from the facility toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Wade felt the weight of completed responsibility settling around his shoulders. He hadn't been able to save Sarah, but he'd completed her mission. He hadn't been able to save every animal in that underground hell, but he'd saved some and ensured that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. Rebecca reached across the truck's cab to squeeze his hand, and Wade felt the healing that comes when family bonds are restored through shared purpose and mutual respect. They'd fought together, risked together, and emerged together with evidence that would prevent future atrocities. Echo purred softly in her carrier, a sound of contentment that Wade hadn't heard since her early days of recovery. She'd led him to the truth about Apex's operations, and through that truth to a resolution of grief he'd carried for 10 years. Sometimes the smallest creatures carried the largest responsibilities, and sometimes healing required confronting the sources of harm rather than simply treating its symptoms. Wade looked in his rearview mirror at the canyon that contained Apex's facility and felt the satisfaction that came from missions completed, according to moral imperatives rather than personal convenience. Tomorrow would bring federal investigations, legal proceedings, and the complex work of rehabilitating animals that had been systematically damaged by human cruelty. But tonight, he was driving home with his daughter, his recovered animals, and the knowledge that Sarah's death had finally been acknowledged and her killers brought to justice. Some victories were worth waiting for, especially when they honored the memory of people who died trying to do the right thing. 6 months after the raid on Apex Biosolutions, Wade stood on his porch watching the sunrise paint the Toyabe Mountains in shades of gold and amber. The view was the same as it had been for 15 years, but everything else about his life had changed, in ways he could never have imagined. When he'd first found a small Bobcat kitten following him through the sagebrush, the letter of confession that had sealed Dr. Kane's fate lay framed on his kitchen wall, not out of vindictiveness, but as a reminder that truth had a way of emerging despite the best efforts of those who tried to bury it. Kane's detailed admission of the animal experimentation program and her role in Sarah's murder had provided the legal foundation for prosecutions that extended far beyond Apex, to include military contractors and federal officials who had enabled the illegal research. Wade's ranch had been transformed into the Sarah Merritt Wildlife Sanctuary, named in honor of the woman whose courage had ultimately exposed the systematic cruelty hidden in the desert canyons. The main house remained largely unchanged, but the barn had been expanded into a comprehensive veterinary facility capable of treating the complex medical and psychological trauma that characterized animals recovered from experimental programs. 18 animals had survived the rescue, operation and subsequent rehabilitation. 3 mountain lions, 2 wolves, a family of foxes, several coyotes, and Echo, all of them bearing scars from their captivity, but gradually reclaiming their natural instincts through patient care and time. Some would never be fully wild again, but they'd found peace in the sanctuary's protected environment, where their particular needs could be understood and accommodated. Rebecca had taken a leave of absence from her hospital position in Denver and moved to a small house 2 miles from the ranch, close enough to help with daily operations, but far enough to maintain the independence she'd inherited from both her parents. Her medical training had proved invaluable in developing rehabilitation protocols for animals whose psychological and physical trauma required approaches that didn't exist in standard veterinary practice. "Good morning, Dad," Rebecca said, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the easy familiarity that had replaced the careful distance of their previous relationship. "How's Echo this morning?" Wade gestured toward the ridge behind the house, where the young Bobcat could be seen moving through the early morning light with the confident stride of a predator reclaiming her territory. Echo had been free to leave the sanctuary for months now, but she'd chosen to establish her territory in the areas surrounding Wade's ranch, returning each evening to the barn where she'd first learned to trust human compassion. "Independent, but not quite ready to cut all ties," Wade replied. "I think she understands that this is home base, even if she doesn't need constant care anymore." Tom Yazzie had documented Echo's transition from traumatized captive to confident wild bobcat, creating a photographic record that had become central to congressional hearings on military animal research and corporate accountability. His images showed the progression from the small, scarred kitten Wade had found to the healthy adult predator who now served as a symbol of recovery and resilience. The photographer had expanded his project to include all the sanctuary animals, creating a comprehensive documentation of rehabilitation that was being used by veterinary schools and wildlife conservation organizations around the world. His work had helped establish protocols for treating animals recovered from experimental programs, knowledge that was unfortunately becoming more necessary as federal investigations revealed the scope of illegal research conducted by military contractors. Dr. Marcus Reed had taken early retirement from his Defense Department position and established a permanent veterinary clinic on the sanctuary property. His expertise in military animal programs had proved crucial in understanding the specific trauma patterns created by experimental procedures, and his federal connections ensured that the sanctuary received funding and resources needed to continue its mission. Marcus says the latest group of rescued animals should arrive next week. Rebecca mentioned settling into the porch chair that had become her regular spot for morning briefings. 12 animals from a facility in Arizona that was using similar modification techniques. Wade nodded, feeling the mixture of satisfaction and sadness that characterized his new role as advocate for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. Each successful rescue meant that animals were being saved from systematic cruelty, but it also meant that such cruelty was continuing despite the prosecutions and policy changes that had followed the apex exposure. Dolores Martinez had become the sanctuary's coordinator, applying the organizational skills she'd developed during 30 years of teaching to the complex logistics of animal care, volunteer management, and public education. At 63, she'd found a second career that combined her love of learning with her protective instincts for vulnerable creatures, creating programs that brought school groups to visit the sanctuary and learn about wildlife conservation. "The Peterson family is bringing their daughter by this afternoon," Dolores announced, arriving for the daily staff meeting with her usual armload of schedules and updates. She's been asking about bobcats for her school report, and her parents thought meeting Echo might inspire her interest in veterinary medicine. Wade smiled, remembering similar visits he'd made as a child to veterinary clinics, where patient doctors had answered endless questions about animal behavior and medical care. The sanctuary's educational programs were creating connections between children and wildlife that might influenced career choices and conservation attitudes for decades too. Uncome, the federal prosecutions resulting from the Apex investigation had extended far beyond the original research facility. Dr. Kane was serving a life sentence for Sarah's murder and multiple counts of animal cruelty. Apex executives faced decades in prison for their roles in illegal research programs. Most importantly, congressional oversight had been established for all military animal research, with mandatory reporting requirements and independent monitoring that made future abuses more difficult to hide. Wade had testified before 3 congressional committees, describing the systematic cruelty he'd witnessed and the sophisticated technologies being used to transform animals into weapons. His military background and veterinary expertise had provided credibility that helped legislators understand the moral and practical problems created by unregulated experimental programs. The most important thing we can do, Wade had told the Senate Oversight Committee, is remember that these animals are not equipment to be modified for human purposes. They're living beings with their own intrinsic value, and our responsibility is to protect them from exploitation, not to find new ways to use them as tools. The sanctuary had received thousands of letters from people around the world who'd been inspired by Echo's story and the broader mission of protecting animals from experimental abuse. School children sent drawings of bobcats, retired veterinarians offered volunteer services, and wildlife organizations shared resources and expertise that helped expand the sanctuary's capabilities. But for Wade, the most meaningful validation came from the animals themselves. Echo's daily choice to return to the ranch despite her freedom to leave. The gradual relaxation visible in the mountain lions as they learned to trust again. The play behavior that emerged in young foxes as their psychological wounds healed. These small signs of recovery represented victories that no amount of legal prosecution could achieve. As the morning sun climbed higher over the desert, Wade walked the perimeter of the sanctuary with Scout, who had recovered from his injury and resumed his role as unofficial greeter for visiting animals and humans alike. The old border collie moved more slowly than he had 6 months ago, but his enthusiasm for his work remained undiminished. The walking meditation had become Wade's way of processing the complex emotions that came with his transformed life. Grief for Sarah would never entirely disappear, but it had been joined by satisfaction that her death had finally been acknowledged and her mission completed. Anger at the people who'd caused systematic suffering had been tempered by the knowledge that legal justice was being served and policy changes were preventing future abuses. Most surprisingly, Wade had discovered that purpose could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. A simple act of compassion toward an injured animal had led him to uncover corporate crimes, expose government corruption, and create a facility that would protect vulnerable creatures for generations to come. Sarah would have been proud of the sanctuary bearing her name and the legacy it represented. Echo appeared on the ridge above them, her amber eyes reflecting the morning light as she surveyed her territory with the confidence of a predator who'd reclaimed her place in the natural world. She chirped once, a sound of recognition and greeting, before disappearing into the sagebrush to continue her daily patrol. Wade touched the dog tags under his shirt and felt the weight of completed responsibility. He'd learned to heal again, to trust again, to accept the risks that came with caring about things beyond his own safety. The isolation that had protected him for 10 years had given way to connections that made him vulnerable but also gave his life meaning that mere survival couldn't provide. The desert morning was settling into its familiar rhythm of wind and silence, but Wade no longer experienced that silence as emptiness. It had become spacious rather than hollow, filled with the potential for new rescues, new relationships, new opportunities to stand up for creatures that needed advocates. He'd discovered that healing wasn't just about recovering from loss. It was about transforming that loss into purpose that honored what had been taken away. As he walked back toward the house where Rebecca was preparing, for the day's work, and Dolores was coordinating volunteer schedules. Wade reflected on the unexpected ways that love could multiply rather than diminish when it was shared. Sarah's death had taught him to protect his heart from further loss. Echo's recovery had taught him that protected hearts couldn't heal others or themselves. The small bobcat who'd followed him through the desert had led him back to the person he'd been before. Grief had convinced him that caring was too dangerous to risk. Now at 59, Wade had found his way to a life that honored both Sarah's memory and his own capacity for making a difference in a world that still contained too much suffering and too little compassion. Some mornings were new beginnings disguised as ordinary days, and this was clearly one of them.